The church bells rang softly in the distance, their sound echoing through the small town as the golden afternoon sun shone over the white chapel. Inside, the guests were already seated, smiling and whispering excitedly. It was the day everyone had been waiting for, Sophie Turner's wedding day. Sophie stood in front of the mirror, her hands slightly trembling as she adjusted the lace on her wedding gown. She looked like a dream, her soft brown curls falling gracefully over her shoulders, her eyes sparkling with nervous excitement. Her heart was pounding, but not out of fear. She was happy, truly happy. After years of waiting, she was finally going to marry Ryan, the man she believed was the love of her life. Ryan wasn't just her fiancé. He had been her childhood friend, her secret keeper, and the man who promised her forever. They had dreamed of this day together, a home, a family, a life filled with love and laughter. Sophie smiled as she thought about it. "He's the one," she whispered to her reflection, as the bridesmaids helped her get ready. Sophie's mother entered the room, her eyes already teary. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," she said, holding her daughter's hands tightly. "Your father would be so proud." Sophie smiled. "I just hope Ryan doesn't faint when he sees me walking down the aisle." They both laughed, trying to calm the nerves. The ceremony was supposed to start at 4. The clock ticked closer, and the excitement in the air grew. Guests turned their heads toward the big wooden doors, waiting for the groom to make his entrance. The priest stood ready. The music played softly, and Sophie waited in the dressing room, her heart fluttering with anticipation. But then, something unexpected happened. The best man entered the room, his face pale. He looked nervous, his eyes avoiding hers. "Sophie," he began, his voice shaking. Sophie frowned. "What's wrong? Where's Ryan?" He hesitated. He got a call. He said he'd be right back. That was 20 minutes ago. Her smile faded. "Maybe he's just running late," she said quickly, brushing it off. "You know how he is, always nervous before big moments." Minutes passed. Then another 20. The music stopped. The whispers began. Guests started exchanging confused looks. The priest shifted uncomfortably. Sophie's mother tried to stay calm, but her face had turned pale. Sophie walked out of the room, her veil brushing lightly against the floor. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. No one could answer. The best man just looked down, avoiding her eyes. Finally, one of Ryan's friends stepped forward and said softly, "He's gone." "Gone?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He left," the man said. "He got into his car and drove away. No one knows where." For a moment, Sophie stood frozen. Her mind refused to understand the words. The world around her blurred. The flowers, the lights, the people, everything faded into silence. Her chest felt tight, her knees weak. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be true. He wouldn't leave me. Not today." But deep down, a painful truth began to settle in her heart. Ryan had left her. The guests began whispering louder. Some tried to hide their pity. Others just shook their heads. The bridesmaids avoided her eyes. Sophie's mother reached for her, but Sophie pulled away. Her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. She looked toward the altar, the place where she was supposed to start her new life. The flowers were still fresh, the candles still burning, but everything suddenly felt cold and cruel. Her dream had turned into a nightmare within moments. Tears rolled down her cheeks, smudging her makeup. Her veil slipped off as she stood there, trembling, trying to hold herself together. "Why?" she whispered. "What did I do wrong?" Outside, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, as if the sky itself was crying with her. Everyone slowly began to leave, one by one. The music stopped completely, and the beautiful decorations now looked meaningless. The once joyful church was silent, except for the sound of raindrops hitting the glass windows. Sophie walked outside, her white dress soaking in the rain, her bouquet falling from her hands. She didn't care anymore. The man who had promised her forever had left her with nothing but shame and heartbreak. As she sat on the church steps, numb and lost, a faint voice broke through the rain. "Miss, are you all right?" She looked up and saw an old beggar standing under a broken umbrella. His clothes were torn, his hands rough, but his eyes were full of kindness. He held out a small, crumpled handkerchief. "Here," he said gently. "Crying doesn't heal the heart, but sometimes kindness does." Sophie stared at him for a moment, surprised that in her darkest hour, a stranger, someone with nothing, was the only person who cared. She took the handkerchief, whispering a weak thank you. The old man nodded slowly. "Life has strange ways," he said. "When someone leaves, it's often because they were never meant to stay." Sophie looked at him, the words sinking deep into her heart. Maybe he was right. Maybe this pain was not an ending, but the beginning of something she couldn't see yet, as the rain continued to fall. Sophie made a silent promise to herself. She would no longer cry for someone who didn't value her. But little did she know, the man standing before her, this poor old beggar, was about to change her life in a way she could never have imagined. Sophie didn't leave town after that disastrous day. She couldn't. Something in her heart kept her near the small church, maybe because walking away felt like letting her pain win. For days, she stayed inside her mother's house. The wedding dress folded neatly in a box she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Every morning, she looked out the window and watched life go on, the same streets, the same people, but she felt like a stranger in her own world. One rainy afternoon, the same beggar who had comforted her outside the church appeared again. He was standing under a tree, drenched, but smiling softly when he saw her. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him. "You again," she said, half smiling. "You always seem to find me when it rains." He chuckled quietly. "Rain has a way of bringing people together," he replied. "Besides, you looked like you needed a friend that day." Sophie sighed. "I needed someone. Everyone else just left." The old man tilted his head thoughtfully. "People often disappear when pain comes. But pain has its own way of showing us who really matters." They talked for a while under the gray sky. His name was Samuel, a man with a quiet voice and deep, wise eyes. Despite his worn clothes and wrinkled face, there was something peaceful about him, something that made Sophie feel safe. Over the next few days, Sophie found herself meeting Samuel more often. He never asked her for money. Instead, he listened. Sometimes he told stories, strange, beautiful stories about love, loss, and forgiveness. His words had a warmth that melted through her sadness. One evening, Sophie saw a group of people mocking him near the church steps. "Look at that old fool," one of them laughed. "Begging again, huh?" Sophie's heart burned with anger. She marched over and stood between them and Samuel. "Leave him alone," she snapped. "He's a better person than any of you will ever be." The crowd went silent, embarrassed, and walked away. Samuel looked at her with kind eyes. "You didn't have to do that, my dear." "Yes, I did," she replied. "You were the only one who stood by me when no one else did. That's worth something." He smiled. Kindness always returns to those who give it. That night, Sophie went home and couldn't stop thinking about him. She realized that the world only saw Samuel's torn clothes, not his gentle heart. And in a moment of emotion, she made a decision that shocked even herself. The next morning, she put on a simple white dress, went to the same church where she had been abandoned, and asked Samuel to meet her there. When he arrived, looking confused, she said calmly, "Do you remember what you told me the day I was left here? That sometimes when people walk away, fate has a better plan." He nodded slowly. "I remember. "Well," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "I think maybe that plan is you." Samuel blinked, stunned. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" She took a deep breath. "I want to marry you." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The few people inside the church gasped. "You can't be serious," one of them whispered. "He's just a beggar." But Sophie's eyes were calm. "No," she said firmly. "He's a man with a kind heart, something far rarer than wealth or looks. I've already been left by someone who had everything. This time, I choose someone who has nothing except honesty." Samuel's hands trembled. "My dear, I'm too old, too poor. You deserve a better life than this." She smiled faintly. "Maybe my definition of better has changed." And just like that, in the same place where she was once humiliated, Sophie said her vows again, this time not in front of a grand crowd, but before a few witnesses, with a man who had nothing to offer her except sincerity. When she took his hand, everyone thought she had lost her mind. But deep in her heart, Sophie felt free for the first time in her life. After the small ceremony, Samuel and Sophie walked together through the quiet streets. He led her to a small, broken-down cottage at the edge of town, his home. It wasn't much, but he welcomed her with a warm smile. "I'm sorry I can't give you the life you're used to," he said softly. Sophie shook her head, her eyes gentle. "I didn't marry you for that. I married you because I see something in you the world doesn't." And so began a strange and beautiful new chapter of her life. She cooked simple meals, helped fix the old roof, and planted flowers in the tiny garden. They lived humbly, but Sophie had never known such peace. Samuel treated her with respect and affection, never raising his voice or taking her kindness for granted. Slowly, the sadness in Sophie's heart began to fade. The laughter she thought she'd lost forever found its way back. There were no fancy dinners or diamond rings, only shared stories, quiet sunsets, and the warmth of companionship. But one thing still puzzled her: Samuel's calmness. There was something about him she couldn't quite understand. He spoke like a man who had seen the world, who carried secrets too deep to share. And then, one day, she would discover exactly who he really was. And that truth would be more surreal than anything she had ever imagined. Asterisk. The morning light spilled softly through the cracks of the old cottage, casting golden patterns across the floor. Sophie woke to the gentle sound of birds singing outside and the comforting scent of freshly brewed tea. It had been months since her life had taken that unbelievable turn from being abandoned at the altar to marrying an old beggar. And yet, as strange as it sounded, she had never felt this peaceful before. Every day with Samuel was simple but meaningful. He treated her with kindness, spoke to her with patience, and looked at her like she was something precious. There were no grand gestures, no fancy gifts, but in his quiet ways, he showed her what true love really meant. He never once asked her for anything. Instead, he worked small jobs around town, fixing fences or carrying goods, always bringing back something for her: flowers, fresh bread, or sometimes just a smile. But something about Samuel had always felt mysterious. His way of speaking was too refined, too thoughtful for a man who claimed to have lived on the streets. The way he carried himself, his calm voice, even his handwriting, it all hinted at a past that didn't quite fit his current life. Sophie noticed it many times, but never asked, afraid of breaking the peace they had built. One day, as Sophie was cleaning the small wooden chest in their cottage, she found a faded envelope hidden beneath a stack of old books. Her curiosity grew when she saw a seal stamped in gold, something far too elegant to belong to a beggar. Inside was a letter addressed to Sir Samuel Whitlock, a name she had never heard before. The paper was old, but carried words that made her heart race. It spoke of a business empire, charitable donations, and a life that sounded worlds away from the man she knew. When Samuel returned home that evening, Sophie was sitting silently, the letter in her hands. "Samuel," she began softly, "who are you really?" For a moment, he froze, then sighed deeply. The mask he had worn for so long slipped away, and his eyes filled with something between guilt and relief. "I suppose," he said slowly, "you deserve to know the truth." He sat beside her and began to tell his story. Years ago, he had been one of the wealthiest men in the country, a successful businessman who owned several companies. But after losing his wife and son in a tragic accident, he had grown bitter and disillusioned. Surrounded by people who only loved him for his wealth, he decided to walk away from it all. Disguised as a beggar, he spent years living among the poor, searching for one thing, proof that genuine kindness still existed. "I lost faith in love," he said quietly. "I wanted to see if people could still care without money, without fame, without gain. I met many, but only one person ever looked at me and saw more than my torn clothes. That person was you, Sophie." Sophie sat frozen, tears welling in her eyes. "All this time, you were never poor." Samuel smiled faintly. "I was rich in everything except peace. You gave me that again." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to be sure," he said gently. "You married me out of compassion, not because of what I owned. I didn't want to change that, but now, I think it's time you see who I really am." The next morning, Samuel took her to the city, but instead of walking the familiar streets, he guided her to a large estate on the hill. As the gates opened, Sophie gasped. In front of her stood a beautiful mansion surrounded by gardens, fountains, and people waiting respectfully at the door. The servants bowed and greeted Samuel as Sir Whitlock. Sophie's heart pounded as he turned to her, his eyes kind and full of pride. "This was my home," he said softly. "And now, it's ours." Tears streamed down Sophie's face. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Everything she thought she knew about her husband had changed, and yet, deep down, nothing truly had. He was still the same man who gave her a handkerchief in the rain, who listened when everyone else turned away, who reminded her that love didn't depend on wealth or status. When night fell, they stood on the balcony overlooking the garden. The moonlight touched Samuel's face as he took her hand. "You thought you lost everything the day you were left at that altar," he said softly. "But that day, fate was bringing you to me. I may have tested the world, but you tested my heart, and you passed in a way no one else could." Sophie smiled through her tears. "I didn't need a rich man," she whispered. "I just needed a real one." Samuel smiled back, his eyes shining. "Then I suppose we both found what we were looking for." From that day on, Sophie's life transformed completely. She became known not just as Sir Samuel Whitlock's wife, but as a woman whose compassion changed a man's soul. Together, they opened a foundation to help abandoned brides and homeless women find shelter and hope. A tribute to the moment that changed both their lives forever. And whenever people asked her how her story began, Sophie would simply smile and say, "Once I was left at the altar. But the man I ended up marrying turned out to be the greatest blessing of my life."